My name is Jaylen Blue, and I'm a Master's in Public Policy student in the Education Policy Program, Class of 2018. And I'm here tonight to introduce our moderator for the evening, Vice Chancellor for Athletics and University Affairs and Athletics Director David Williams. Since adding athletics to his multiple titles and responsibilities in 2002, Vice Chancellor Williams has overseen an athletics department recognized as being among the nation's most innovative and successful. The 2016-2017 academic year may have been the best yet, with 8 Vanderbilt teams reaching NCAA postseason competition. Furthermore, he continues to serve as a tenured professor at the law school, where he teaches courses on taxation and education, as well as sports law. Please join me in welcoming David Williams to the stage.
Thank you, Jaylen. Good evening and welcome, and thanks for braving the cold weather. Chancellor Zeppels is unable to attend this evening, but he sends his sincere regrets. He did speak with our keynote speaker earlier today, and a podcast of that recording will be available on our website at a later date. Tonight, I am privileged to introduce Dr. Jaylen Cole. Jaylen is the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University, where he specializes in post-Civil War African-American history, 20th century American politics, and the history of the Cold War. He also serves as a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he often writes about racial justice and its interaction with politics, history, and culture. In 2015, he was awarded the Hillman Prize for Opinion Analyst Journalism. In awarding it, the jury wrote the following: "No one has done a better job of placing the events in Ferguson, Missouri, and similar happenings in their broader contents than Dr. Cole." Further, Cobb met the challenge of describing the turmoil in Ferguson in a way that cut through the frantic chaos of breaking news and deepened readers' understanding of what they were seeing, hearing, and feeling. As the NFL season comes to a close, the nation is primed to reflect on the powerful platforms that football players and other athletes and entertainers provide for civil rights movements. Dr. Cobb has written about this topic as well in his September 24, 2017 column in The New Yorker entitled "From Louis Armstrong to the NFL, Ungrateful is the New Uppity." Dr. Cobb comments on the Huntsville, Alabama rally, where President Trump called out players who took a knee during the national anthem to protest racial inequality. He recalled the time some 60 years earlier when jazz trumpeter, great Louis Armstrong, canceled a planned tour to the Soviet Union to protest. Tonight, he will expound upon this topic. Will you please join me in welcoming to the stage the scholar and important contemporary voice who is helping paint the picture of race relations in America more clearly. Dr. Cobb, it is a great honor to have you with us tonight. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Hey, how are you all? Good. Thank you for coming out. First off, I came here from New York, and I was under the severely misinformed perception that I was coming south, so it'd be warmer. And so imagine my shock when it was 40 degrees when I left New York, and I landed and it was 9 degrees here. And I was like, this is not the way things are supposed to go. And so I was actually, on the way over here, I was telling the young man that, I said, my father is from a little town called Hazelhurst, Georgia. Clap your hands if you heard of it. Yeah, that's polite applause, that's all right. So he's from a little town called Hazelhurst, Georgia, which is in South Georgia. And he said when it got this cold down there, they'd go to church. And he said, to keep warm? I said, no, to pray. He would say, like, this kind of cold weather, we need divine intervention. So I'm happy to be here. and I'm happy to be able to talk about the significance and legacy of Dr. King. I know there's some other kinds of issues we're going to get to. We're going to talk about Louis Armstrong, and we'll talk about the NFL and athletics, I promise, but I want to make sure that we get to some preliminary things, some elements of our contemporary conversation, some things that are going on in the contemporary context that we might not have paid as close attention to as we need to. And so as I was kind of preparing for the King holiday, it was striking to me, just a couple days before, when I heard the comments that the president made about countries in Africa and Haiti. And this was disturbing to me because, for a number of reasons. One, because I believe in treating people with respect and dignity, but in addition to this, because I'm a historian. And so I started thinking about this and saying that we're able to have this conversation and hear these kinds of statements and these kinds of perceptions of brothers and sisters from Haiti, because we don't really actually know how indebted the United States is to Haiti and the ways in which Haiti's history is intricately interwoven with American history. And just one quick way, and I'm going to actually talk about this a little bit more, but one quick point is that when our young people are in school, they invariably learn about Thomas Jefferson and learn about Jefferson's presidency and his great achievement in the Louisiana Purchase that doubled the size of the United States, that there are 13 states in whole or some portion that are carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, and he managed to negotiate this acquisition for the fire sale price of just $15 million. It's kind of pinnacle moment in early American history, the history of the young republic. But what we tend not to talk about when we talk about that portion of American history is the fact that Napoleon was motivated to make this deal because of the catastrophic damage to the French economy that the Haitian Revolution had wreaked. And that Haiti had been the prime French colony, and that it provided somewhere around 2/3 of France's exports, mainly in the form of sugar. And when the Haitian slave revolt began, it had such disastrous implications that he was entitled to go to the negotiating table and give Thomas Jefferson the deal of his lifetime. And so in that way, the United States is connected to the history of Haiti. And in addition to this, when we see in 1808, the United States abolishes the transatlantic slave trade. And again, this is kind of in the list of progressive developments and evolution of American history. We talk about this as a kind of great moment, but we also don't talk about the fact that this was inspired by the slave uprising that became the Haitian Revolution, that people were very antsy that this could be a model of a successful mass slave uprising. And so the idea of importing more Africans was something that people were not particularly fond of. And so the end of the slave trade was connected to the history of Haiti. And if we moved a little bit further into the 19th century, we reach another point in American history that we talk about as a kind of great achievement, and that is Abraham Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, which he issues in September of 1862, takes effect in January of 1863. And one of the things that should be noted is that after the Haitian Revolution, the United States is the first republic in the Western Hemisphere, and Haiti is the second state to throw off the yoke of colonialism and declare itself independent. And as a result, as a consequence of this, the Haitians are stigmatized and penalized. The United States does not recognize them diplomatically for almost 6 decades after the Haitian Revolution concludes. And when they do, this happens in July of 1862. July of 1862, Abraham Lincoln recognizes Haiti diplomatically. In September of 1862, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, One of the footnotes, one of the asterisks in the Emancipation Proclamation, and something that contrasts our kind of standard narrative of Abraham Lincoln and his ideas on race, is that we overlook the fact that Lincoln intended, for most of the time he flirted with the idea of issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. He paired it with an idea of deporting the black population en masse. And so there are all these questions that come up. How can we do this? When can this happen? What are the mechanisms by which this can happen? And he strikes upon the idea that the black American population could all just be sent to Haiti upon emancipation at the conclusion of the war. It is this idea that he eventually jettisons. A number of people, including Frederick Douglass, express their severe contempt for this idea that the population that had built the American economy would then be systematically excluded from the profits that it had created. Meanwhile, there was no conversation about expelling the leaders of the southern states that had attempted to overthrow Lincoln's government and were attempting to assassinate him. And so in this way, we can kind of go even further in this, we find all these connections between the United States and Haiti. And so when I heard these comments, it was reflective of things I tend to think about when we think about Dr. King. And one kind of conclusion that's inescapable from our understanding of American history is that the parameters of our empathy, the parameters of our ability to recognize someone else's humanity are exactly equal to the parameters of our democracy. And so when we look at the place where we can no longer recognize someone's humanity, that is the place where our democracy and our democratic practices typically stop. And so Dr. King spent his life trying to expand those boundaries, trying to expand those parameters. And so in 1967, King had come to a crossroads and looking at the history of the civil rights movement, looking at what had been achieved, and he left the United States for 4 weeks and went to Jamaica and devoted himself to outlining his thoughts on where the movement could go. And it's important to think about why he did this in 1967. In that year, he had kind of come to terms with the growing backlash against the movement that had gained so much momentum over the preceding dozen years. We look at the King of 1955 in Montgomery, the young idealistic king who is made the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association precisely because of his youth and the relative lack of connections that he had to the structures in Alabama. People thought that, well, we're going to try to have this protest about segregation. Let's get the new guy. And Dr. King was just 26 years old when he assumed the leadership of this movement. And over the course of that decade, that crucial decade, the civil rights movement makes these signal achievements. The crisis in Little Rock happens in 1957. We see the passage of a Civil Rights Act, a watered-down Civil Rights Act in 1957. We see the March on Washington, the 250,000 people who come to Washington, D.C. to pressure the Kennedy administration on the issues of civil rights in 1963. In 1964, we see the passage and signing of the Civil Rights Act of that year. In 1965, in a stunning achievement, we see the passage and signing of the Voting Rights Act of that year. And the movement had, in a relatively short period of time, achieved a tremendous amount. If you were looking at between 1955 and 1945, where there's a kind of incremental change, and then we see 1955 to 1965, there's tremendous change. But by 1966, you begin to see a different tenor within the movement. And you begin to see a different dynamic that it encounters. There'd always been people pushing back against what Dr. King was trying to achieve, but this began to take on a different form. In 1966, as they led a movement around access to housing and desegregation in the North, and led a march in Cicero, a suburb of Chicago, they encountered the violent hostility, not simply of people opposed to the cause of civil rights, but of the American Nazi Party. And there are people who advocate themselves, who refer to themselves as Nazis, who become a strikingly familiar part of the anti-civil rights movement backlash. By 1967, there are rumblings of this in national politics. George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, is running for president on an explicitly anti-civil rights platform. In 1968, just a year after this, we see Richard Nixon, who runs on a platform of law and order, which is implicitly attempting to push back against the civil rights movement, and deploys what comes to be known as a Southern strategy, bringing disaffected white Southerners into the fold of the Republican Party. And these are the national dynamics that King is thinking about as he sits down to put his thoughts together in what becomes the book, Where Do We Go From Here? And in it, King says this, a chapter called The White Backlash. The backlash is nothing new. It is the surfacing of old prejudices, hostilities, and ambivalences that have always been there. The white backlash of today is rooted in the same problem that has characterized America ever since the black man landed in chains on the shores of this nation. The source of this backlash is the congenital deformity of racism that has crippled the nation from its inception. Historically, it was so acceptable in American life that today it still only lightly burdens the conscience. No one surveying the moral landscape of our nation can overlook the pathetic wreckage of commitment twisted and torn to 1,000 shapes under the stress of prejudice and irrationality. Dr. King was talking about this backlash even as it was developing, even as it was coming into fruition. And this dynamic that he talks about, it was in fact not new. And I'd submit that we are actually living in one of these moments of backlash. And that a great deal that we understand, a great deal that we've seen in American politics, a great deal that we've seen in American society can be best understood through the lens of what Dr. King was explaining. And so when we think about this, like the boom and bust cycles of progress in American history, they take on a kind of very familiar and cyclical nature. The Emancipation Proclamation and 13th Amendment abolished slavery. If anyone have seen the film 13th, you know the complications around how the 13th Amendment ended slavery and the exception to people who've been convicted of a crime, and the way that this becomes a part of the national narrative of mass incarceration that we're still grappling with. But in the wake of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are ratified. The 14th Amendment provides citizenship and equal protection under law for all who are born here. The 15th Amendment allows African American men to have the right to vote. And so you see a tremendous amount of social change in a short period of time. And between 1865 and 1877, if you go back to newspapers, particularly northern newspapers of that time, you can find commentary where people say that the United States, although it has had slavery since its inception, it is well on the way to eradicating the problem of race and racism within its borders. And this sounds kind of wildly idealistic at the time, but people actually did believe this. But implicit within this moment of racial progress was the birth of the Ku Klux Klan in this state, no less. Implicit within this was the rise of black codes that circumscribed the freedoms of the newly emancipated population. Within this moment, we saw the seeds of a backlash that eventually swept African Americans from political power. There were some 600 African Americans who were elected to public office in the South in the wake of the Civil War. And post-Reconstruction, almost all of these individuals are removed from power. States begin passing individual laws that restrict and forbid the suffrage of African Americans. Sharecropping rises as a system that replaces slavery. Convict leasing becomes a means by which people can be arrested and incarcerated and forced to do the same labor that they did as slaves. Segregation rises. And by the beginning of the 20th century, you can you see the faint imprint of what had been a tremendously progressive moment. And when we move a little bit further into the 20th century, we see the mobilization around the First World War and how that attracted people to move in what became the Great Migration, to move out of the South into areas of the North and industrial communities in the Midwest. And as people moved into these areas, they got better access to employment, better access to education. But at the same time, we began to see the dynamics of racial backlash there. And so as this goes on, and the decades, we begin seeing race riots and racial hostilities that crop up in different places. In Detroit, there's a race riot in 1943 intended to drive the black population out. I know now when we think about Detroit, we think the only white person who lives there is Eminem. But in 1920, Detroit was 96% white. And by 1940, the black population had quadrupled. And in 1943, the hostility at the growing number of African Americans had coalesced into a backlash. And so the cycle that Dr. King is talking about in 1967 is informed. He's able to look backward and say that we have been within this moment. We have seen these sorts of dynamics take place previously. And that they've, with a terrible kind of regularity, followed the trajectory and the fault lines of race in this society. It is a fundamental element of what has deformed American democracy from the outset. And when I talk about this, I know I'm a historian and a writer, and I write a lot about race, and people have sometimes accused me of seeing race everywhere and saying, why do you talk about race so much? And I'm like, well, you can't understand the United States without understanding race. And people think that this is an exaggeration, and I always tell them this story to kind of make the point that about a year ago, I gave a talk in Maine, and it was a Martin Luther King Day talk, and I told the people who had come, I was like, it's interesting to note that this state only exists because of slavery. And they go, oh. They're quiet for a second, and they go, oh, right, yeah. That Compromise of 1820, when Missouri wanted to enter the Union, and that would have tipped the balance. There were 11 free states and 11 slave states. And if Missouri entered as a slave state, or if it had entered in as a free state, it would have tipped the balance one way or another. There had been one set that had 2 more senators and a number of more congressional reps than the anti-slavery side or the pro-slavery side, whichever way Missouri went. And so you wind up with this kind of burning conflict around what will happen in Missouri. And the compromise that's made is that Missouri will be allowed to enter as a slave state, and Maine is carved out as a new state in New England in order to counterbalance it. And that's how Maine comes into existence. And after this talk, I leave Maine and I fly to Florida. And I told the people in the audience at Florida what I'd told the people in Maine. And they were like, oh, wow, yeah. And I was like, well, before you get too smug, let's think about how Florida became part of the United States. In 1819, when an upstart general named Andrew Jackson marched into what was then a Spanish possession and seized it on behalf of disgruntled slaveholders in Georgia who were upset about their chattel property fleeing across the national boundary into Spanish territory, knowing that the Spanish would not return them to slavery. And so if we talk about people running to the north for freedom, if this was prior to 1819, 1820, a person who was enslaved in South Carolina or Georgia or Alabama would run further south into Florida. And if we talked about Texas, and we say remember the Alamo, we don't say remember everything about the Alamo, because part of the dynamics that allowed Texas to secede from Mexico were the tensions between the Americans and the Americans living there and the Mexican government around the fact that the Mexican government had given free land to American farmers, but said one of the rules of cultivating this land, at first you have to convert to Catholicism, which was a principle they immediately ignored. And secondly, you cannot bring slaves here, another principle that they immediately ignored. And so this was part and parcel of the dynamics that led to Texas seceding, or California, which entered the Union in 1850 as a result of the Compromise of 1850. So the way that California became a state was that they strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. This was the compromise. California got statehood and the creation of a federal agency to track down black people who had been fortunate enough to escape from slavery and drag them back into slavery. So we really can't get beyond this question of race and understanding American society. It's not simply black-white. It's not simply the way in which this backlash has been formulated to understand. In the 1870s, the creation of something called the Workingmen's Party in California, they began to organize around a population that they thought was taking jobs from white people and bringing illegal drugs into the country. And that population was the Chinese. And this helped culminate in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which severely limited the number of Chinese who could come into the United States. If we looked in the 20th century, we see concerns and paranoia that there is a religious group that is aligned with groups that want to see America destroyed, groups that have hostile interests toward the United States. And members of this religious group are placed under surveillance, and many of them are expelled from the country. And no, these are not Muslims, but these are Jews. And this finds expression in the 1924 Immigration Act, which severely restricts the ability of a number of groups, Italians, Irish, Jews among them, to enter the United States. And so we've seen these fractures and these backlashes previously, and they're part of the landscape that we're talking about now, what Dr. King was talking about. And so it's in this context of thinking about these things that when I was writing about Louis Armstrong, I wasn't simply writing about Louis Armstrong. And Louis Armstrong, who is the incredible jazz musician and popular performer, and he's thought of as one of the few African Americans, who's able to transcend racial boundaries. He performs for largely white audiences. He's criticized by other musicians for his willingness to perform in racially segregated venues. And so this is the kind of perception that people have of Louis Armstrong. A lot of African Americans see him as kind of, meek, or what people might have called a sellout or Uncle Tom. And in 1957, amid the tumultuous crisis in Little Rock, as the governor, Orville Faubus, refuses to obey the Supreme Court order of 1954 to desegregate schools, an interviewer, a young, high school journalist, asks Louis Armstrong what he thinks of it, and he blows up. He says things that I can't repeat here. And he says, mother, father, not. Something similar to that, though. And he goes on this kind of tirade. And the backlash against him, he's talking about what's happening here, where there are mobs of people who are poised to attack young children as they are attempting to enter Central High School, which is being integrated. And his defense of these children brings a kind of catastrophic turmoil down on his head. The backlash is swift and severe. He has concerts canceled. He's referred to as ungrateful. There are people who say that he is attempting to create problems where there are none. And his career is severely damaged as a result of this. If we fast forward a few years to 1969, there's a baseball player by the name of Curt Flood who plays in St. Louis, wants to end his career in St. Louis, and he learns in 1969 that he's going to be traded to the Cubs. Does not want to go. Refuses, which is not permitted in the rules of baseball at this point in time, the contractual rules of baseball at this point in time. And rather than be traded, he sits out the entire season saying that I am not simply a commodity. Curt Flood is an African American. He says, I am not simply a commodity. You can't simply buy and sell and trade me and send me to wherever you want me to go. And we see a similar response, a similar kind of dynamic. In asserting himself and saying that he has the right to his individuality and the right to determine who he performs his labor for, he's referred to as ungrateful. And he receives tons of hate mail. He's widely disparaged. And so if we fast forward to just last year, when we see this commentary around the so-called ungrateful SOBs who are kneeling as a gesture of protest because of police violence and the ways in which excessive force has tended to be directed at African Americans, it follows a well-established pattern. And so there is a point of this, and something else I'd point out to people when I have talk about this subject, which is that we tend to think of these issues around police violence as being about African Americans, and this is one of the reasons that we don't take it very seriously. But if we were to remove all the African Americans and remove all the Latinos from this country, something that I think would make a certain part of this country very happy, but were that to happen, we would notice shortly thereafter that a hell of a lot of white people will get killed by the police each year, in numbers, unarmed individuals, in numbers that would be staggering to other Western democracies, even when we adjust for varying population sizes. And so the more clear way of understanding it is that we have a problem with violence in the society that falls disproportionately on the shoulders of African Americans, but by no means exclusively so. So almost 2 years ago now, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee in protest of the ways in which policing has been conducted in the United States, this was not solely and exclusively something that pertains to African Americans. It was in response to a social issue, a social problem that connects to all of us in this society. And so this has been part of a bigger backlash. And we've seen the same sort of rhetoric deployed about ingratitude and the fact that someone who has achieved a particular status should just shut up and be grateful and so on. And this backlash is notable to me in the ways in which it has almost escaped detection, that we don't refer to it. We don't talk about how this process has been happening. And it was most notable to me when we looked at just a few months ago what happened in Charlottesville and the rallying around individuals who were defending the legacy of Robert E. Lee, and this new development that we've had about the conflict over what the Confederacy was. And a few months before that in New Orleans, when Mayor Mitch Landrieu attempted to remove 4 Confederate-themed statues, and it resulted in there being death threats directed at him and people having to conduct these removals in the middle of the night wearing bulletproof vests and masks so that no one would know their identity. And it's been part of this kind of ongoing thing where we've never been able to kind of quite grapple with the nature of the fault line of race in American society. One of the more amusing things is that when there was this conversation about the removal of these monuments, there were people saying one of the monuments was the Obelisk that was in New Orleans, devoted to the Battle of Liberty Place, which was a race riot in the early 1890s, which unseated and removed the interracial police force in New Orleans and replaced it with an all-white one. And there's an actual monument to this. And the defenders of the monument said that, well, this is not about race, this is about heritage and pride, except that on the base of the monument, it said, dedicated to the cause of white supremacy. And so it's a kind of metaphor for the ways in which we refuse to engage this problem and this fault line, and the reason that it continues to reinforce and reoccur again and again and again. I noticed a similar dynamic last year when I was in South Carolina to cover the Dylann Roof trial. And I was there for 3 weeks, and I'd walk back and forth between my hotel and the courtroom. And one day on my way back from the courtroom, I happened to notice that right there in about the midpoint, there is a Confederate museum. So I'd wander into the Confederate Museum, and there are 2 women there, one who's in her 40s maybe, and one who's maybe in her 60s. And they greet me, both white women, they greet me very politely and welcome me to the museum. And they ask, what brings me to Charleston? And I said, well, I'm here to cover the Dylann Roof trial. And the younger woman said, oh, that's just terrible. We don't need a trial. We should just get rid of him. And I was struck by this. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, we should just get rid of him. And I said, well, it's interesting that you say that. The jury is now deliberating about whether or not to give him the death penalty. And she said, there's nothing to deliberate about. Get rid of him. And so I asked the obvious question. What do you say about the fact that Dylann Roof, who killed 9 people in Emmanuel AME Church, 9 African Americans, he did so in support of the same cause that is being memorialized in this museum? So there's an awkward silence. And she says, that's not true. He doesn't know anything about the Confederacy. And I said, but why do you think he posed with the Confederate flag? And she said, he doesn't understand anything about this symbol. And so I said further, why do you think that white supremacist organizations across the world pose with the Confederate flag? And she said, the older woman said, well, people can just find anything on the internet, and they don't know what the symbols mean, and the Confederate cause was not about hate, and it was not about destruction. It was not about killing. And I thought about this was like notable because as she said this, she's standing next to a Confederate cannon, and I was just this point. And so this is the nature of the cycle that we've been caught in. And we find this again and again. Watching this happen in Charlottesville around the same questions that have been unanswered, the same questions Dr. King was talking about in 1967. And so I was watching the television, and I see people marching and saying, you will not replace us, which I found to be really compelling. It was a kind of striking point to hear this. saying, "You will not replace us." And I'm someone who travels a lot. I talk to a lot of different groups. I wrote an in-depth article, about 6,000 words, about the founder of Black Lives Matter. I cover a lot of activist-type organizations. I can guarantee you no one has ever pulled me aside and said, "Psst, don't tell anyone. We're going to replace the white people." That's not the conversation that people have. That's not the idea that people have. I got a letter, or an email from someone who, when I was written something about immigration, and he said, "Be honest, you'd be as alarmed as I am if there were lots of white people coming to this country illegally." And I said, "Not really." It's like, I think that what's happening is that you're presuming that there's a kind of equal demographic paranoia, and that if other people were in your shoes, they would react the same way. And I was like, no, I think more precisely, the people who you disagree with want there to be equality and want there to be opportunity for everyone, not a matter of saying there are more white people or more brown people or more black people or more Asian people. That's not the concern. The concern is that we are able to coexist and treat all of us equally. I think this is the fundamental point that Dr. King was trying to get across. And so, looking at this particular moment, I think that it can be kind of depressing. But I think that the importance of having Dr. King recognized, having a holiday that is dedicated to him, is at least at this point, the utility of his example and the reminder that the struggles that are behind us are by and large bigger than the struggles that are in front of us. That there's an example of the kind of heroic optimism that's necessary for change to happen in society. Dr. King notably said that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, that it requires that people of conscience actually work and put our shoulders to the wheel collectively to make society move in the direction that is more fair and more equal. When we look at the concept of people saying, "You will not replace us," we can think about Dr. King saying that we are all bound by an inescapable web of mutuality. So it is not the idea of replacing us. He talked about the idea of agape and the beloved community, that we are able to see each other for each other's humanity. And that is the counterpoint. It becomes, this is the response. This is how the outlook that we adopt in moments such as this one. And finally, there's a point that Dr. King made in Oslo as he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. And he took a moment to explain the significance of the phrase, "We shall overcome." And he said many people thought that they were saying this to their opponents, but more precisely, they were saying this to themselves. There was a kind of mantra. And in his words, he said that this phrase helped them sustain their faith in the face of an uncertain future. And it would give their weary feet, renewed strength as they marched on toward the city of freedom. When our days grow dreary with low-hanging clouds, and our nights are darker than 1,000 midnights, we will nonetheless know that we are witnessing the creative turmoil of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. This civilization that Dr. King talked about has not yet been born. This is the work that he left to us, but he also left us the heroic example of the kind of faith and optimism that is necessary to create significant change. And saying that we shall overcome is not simply a slogan, but an accurate forecast of the future we are helping to create. Thank you.
Thank you. Oops, that was pretty
careful.
good. That was pretty great. We've collected some questions both before you came over and even as it was going on. But I want to start with one. As you talked about sort of Dr. King's legacy, and you talked about many excellent examples, I'm drawn to a point that was made last week when we were in Washington, D.C. at an event. And Dr. Harry Edwards was part of it. And Dr. Harry Edwards says, you have to come to the grips now of understanding that really this issue is about white supremacy. And he even says that we need to stop thinking about the original sin of America being slavery and recognize that the original sin of America is white supremacy. And until that is dealt with, I don't know how you deal with it, we will continue to have the same problems. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's like kind of splitting hairs, because the ability to create slavery was a product of the ideology of white supremacy. But at the same time, the economic incentives that incentivized slavery were reinforced by the doctrine of white supremacy. Like there's a kind of mutual and perpetual reinforcement between those two dynamics. And so when we look at, one of the things I think is interesting when you look at the new museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian African American Museum, as people were referring to it, the Blacksonian. If you go to that museum, you kind of start at the bottom and kind of work your way up to the top of the building. And in the 17th century portion of it, when you're looking at North America, well, I think one of the many things that they get right there is depicting just how unfamiliar the 17th century world would look to us now. So there are black people who are indentured servants, there are black people who are enslaved, there are white people who are indentured servants. In various places, their statuses may overlap with each other. It's not uncommon for black and white indentures to intermarry. It's not uncommon for black and white people to run away, to try to escape from the places where they're held to labor together. It's not entirely uncommon for them to have children together. All the things that we would associate, we kind of think that the further back we go, the more entrenched these ideas were, and that they released their grip, or they became decreasingly powerful as we moved into the future. But the fact is that there's a kind of decision moment, the decision point, where white supremacy begins to assert itself as a dominant ideology that influences the way American society develops. And so, Maryland passes a law making interracial marriage illegal. Virginia passes a law making it certain that a person who's enslaved will carry the status of their mother. And so this is reconciling the question of what happens with the offspring of white men who are sexually assaulting black women who are enslaved, that they are producing essentially profit. It incentivizes rape because they can profit from the enslaved status of that offspring. And so it's over the course of that time that it develops. And so we get to the 18th century and you're looking at Jefferson and the influence of the Enlightenment and the ideas of rationality and the fact that there's not a divine right of sovereign right of kings, and the educability of human beings, and that you can actually make complicated decisions for yourself, and that coexists with the kind of birth and modern birth, I would say, and ascent of ideas of race based upon skin color. There's all these other kinds of ways in which people have categorized race. If we looked at kind of European history, we see at various points, French and Germans and British considered themselves to be of different races. And the word race is used just simply in kind of reference as a bloodline or a tribe or a clan or group. And so it's important to remember that race hasn't always been one thing. And so what we think of as white supremacy doesn't explain the entirety of how this operates in every single context.
One of our students writes, do you think there's a double standard in America where people celebrate Martin Luther King Day but protest against those who refuse to stand for the national anthem?
Oh yeah, I meant to say, shout out to Dr. Gu, who I spoke to before I came here. Yeah, I think that there is that. We have that same sort of thing. That Dr. King has been taken out of his context. King was not popular in his lifetime. King was, in the year before his death, I think in public polls, 2/3 of whites had negative views of him versus 1/3 that had a positive, favorable view of him. King was thought of as dangerous by white people and too moderate by a lot of black people. And so in his death, there's been the creation of this kind of user-friendly version of Dr. King. But the version of him that denounced the Vietnam War, Lyndon B. Johnson, who signed the '64 Civil Rights Act and signed the '65 Voting Rights Act, thought he had King in his pocket. It's like, I've given this dude, at high cost, no less, I've given this dude everything he wanted. And we have basically committed suicide in the South. For Democrats, if we want to have an electoral chance. And we did this in response to this movement. And so he felt stabbed in the back that King turned around and denounced the Vietnam War. But he was not someone who was generally willing to sacrifice his moral authority, for the kind of transactional politics. And if we were looking at that example now, Dr. King would have a lot to say about our immigration policies now. Dr. King would have a lot to say about the ways in which we are stigmatizing religious groups, and we have kind of almost normalized that. Dr. King would have a lot to say about the militarism in American society, not just now, but particularly now, that have been dynamics. Dr. King would have a lot to say about the materialism that we've embraced, which is not unrelated to these other elements of militarism. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that there are, it's very much easier to accept the version of Dr. King that we very much typically encounter, as opposed to the activist tradition that's contemporary that Dr. King represented.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think back over that period of time, and you're right in the sense that I actually see there were two periods of time when Dr. King was clearly not accepted by most Americans. I mean, in the very beginning, he was very, very feared, and it took sort of the evolution of people like H. Rap Brown and Malcolm X, the more violent and the more any means necessary to make him sort of acceptable.
Right.
And then towards the end, when he does come out and say, well, wait a minute, I kind of haven't gotten this all together where I want it to be, and the fact of the matter is we need to be out of Vietnam. That's a illegal war. That's a immoral war that they started to go against him again. And now we all seem to think of, maybe that war wasn't quite right. Maybe the government hadn't told us the truth. And so do you think that this sort of acceptance and love of, well, what is the reason why this country now seems to embrace Dr. King the way they do?
Well, I think it's also, one, we should be mindful that not everyone embraces him. Like, there are still places where people are recognizing Robert E. Lee's birthday on Martin Luther King Day. As Robert E. Lee, Martin Luther King was born on January 15th, and Lee was born on January 19th. And so that's their response to it. But I think in the way in which King is popularized, it serves a particular political purpose, in that he is a kind of easy access way of symbolizing that you're not racist. That we love Dr. King. How bad could we be? It's like always.
You mean sort of the thing? I got a good friend who's black.
Yeah, some of my best friends are black.
Yeah. Well, maybe not my best friend, but I got friends.
Yeah, I got friends who are black. Although it's funny because I remember I was hearing kind of one of these recent incidents where someone started kind of counting off the number of black people that they knew, as kind of vouching that they weren't bad. And I was like, if you know offhand how many black friends you have, that means you've thought about this previously. You know, and
You had to sit there and
you had
write
to sit
the
there and
names
think
down,
about
yeah,
this.
right.
Like, I have 4 of them now. Okay, that's acceptable. That's a good number. And so I think that that's what has happened. But it's something that happens in kind of all sorts of ways in American history, that we embrace people without embracing, the entire version of them. And as a historian, as somebody who thinks about these questions, I think one of the most disastrous problems in a society, in the abstract sense, one of the most disastrous problems is our inability to relate to our own history, and that's beyond race. That's beyond what we were just talking about. I think that we have this sense of ourselves that is very fragile, and it would be like a person who your interaction with them can only be filtered through the lens of giving them compliments. You can't have an honest interaction with that person, but more fundamentally, that person can't ever grow if you can't have a conversation about what has gone wrong. And so when people are saying, well, why are you tearing the country down, or why do you, always talking about these things that are negative and so on, it's presumed that this comes from an adversarial place, as opposed to saying this comes from a responsibility for people who are interested in seeing democracy exist and flourish.
Another question. What should be higher education's main thrust within the conversation of racial justice, while understanding that many of these same institutions have their own history of discrimination?
Sure. I think that it's a very complicated kind of question now, because when we think about higher education, we've seen skyrocketing cost of tuition, across the country, that's making it harder for people to access education in multiple ways. And so I think this is something that we have to think about, really seriously. That because of the way that the global economy works, that lots of institutions, not just universities, but including universities, know that if you price your services with out of the reach of many Americans, there's still a much broader global audience that can afford to pay. That's one of the things that's happened in real estate, for instance, where I live in New York City, where there's a huge crisis of affordable housing. But if you can't afford to buy a $4 million condo, there is certainly an oligarch in Russia, or a billionaire in China, or someone who's a magnate in India who can afford to buy that apartment. And I think that higher education in this country is part of that problem as well. But when we're talking about this legacy of exclusion, one of the things that I don't do anymore. I'm really happy for people who will and can do it, but I don't do the diversity committees anymore. Because at some point I became convinced that most, maybe not all the time, but most of the time when we have these committees on diversity, it is to give the appearance of being concerned about diversity. But the actual work and labor that it would do to correct the institutional legacies of having decades and decades and decades in which people were expressly forbidden from attending your institution, and how that translates into what we see in the current context, that is actually, all these institutions are complicit in this. And we don't like to talk about this, except in some instances it's harder to escape than others, like Georgetown saying, well, yeah, we sold slaves in order to build the school, or Brown, which is like, yeah, we accepted money from a slave trader in order to buy the campus, or Harvard, or these institutions that have, and I don't want to single out these institutions, the University of Mississippi, these a whole array of places that are connected, and that's just to slavery. And so one of the other dynamics I think that we see now is that when we have these conversations around like affirmative action and diversity, and they're not honest conversations. I write for the New Yorker, and one of the things that happens if you write in any context is that you expect a certain amount of backlash or a certain amount of pushback or angry email, and it's just kind of the thing that and you should have a thick skin about. And a person sent this to me on Twitter, and they referred to me as an affirmative action hack at the New Yorker. And I said, first off, I'm not a hack. But if I was a reflection of affirmative action, I would have zero problems with that. Because my father, who's from a little small town called Hazelhurst, that I mentioned earlier, had a third-grade education. I was a late life baby. I was born when he was 50. But where he grew up, and at the time where he grew up, black people couldn't go beyond the third grade. And so I have a PhD. That's not supposed to happen. A person with a third-grade education is not supposed to have children that have doctorates. However, we talk about this narrative of American progress and moving up in the scale and hierarchy, most of the time, when you create that kind of condition, people tend to stay there intergenerationally. And so if there is some kind of mechanism that said, in redress for your father's third-grade education, we will go the extra mile to try to identify students of color who could participate in this institution on an equal basis, then yeah, I think that would be perfectly fine.
As I was growing up, I used to hear a term and got to understand it. I'm a little older than you, but the concept of this whole thing about your father having a third grade education and where you end up our folks, our people, for long generations valued the concept of education. Education was the great deliverable. But one of the phrases we used to hear back when I was growing up was, he's a race man. Are you a race man?
I'm absolutely a race man.
You're a race man. Okay.
So when people said that, though, it was like a race man. Those were the people who were kind of concerned about kind of community redress, or concerned about the overall well-being of the black community. And I'm not a race man in the sense of believing that race exists. Like, race is a manufactured construct. It doesn't correlate to any kind of fundamental element of difference and distinction between us. But if I'm talking about that in the sense of people who have kind of said that I'm interested in and concerned with contributing to the well-being of a community that's been historically disfranchised, then yeah, I think I'm that. And one of the other things is that, I'm also a product of Howard University, which is where I went to undergrad, and those were kind of laboratories for race men and race women. They were attempting to produce people who were supposed to go out and make the world better for black people, quite frankly. And I think that ethic was part of, it's probably beaten into me by my professors, too.
So do you think in this time and age, I think I know the answer to the question, but I want to ask you, at this point in time in our society, as you've described yourself as being a race man, do we still need to have race men and women?
Yes, but I also feel conflicted about that. And the reason I say that is this. Very often, when there are problems within the black community, they become black problems. But if those same problems affect white people, they become American problems. And so implicit within that is the presumption that black people are not American. And if we are talking about crack was a black problem. Opioids are an American problem. And I know this because of the frequency with which people who are, disagree with me say things like, "What are you doing to help black America?" And it's usually a white person who's saying that. "What are you doing to fix the problem?" And I'm like, "What are you doing? We're both citizens. They're as much my fellow citizen as they are yours." And so I could, by that same token, say to you, what are you doing to fix the opioid problem in New Hampshire? Or what are you doing to fix the crisis of lack of increasing numbers of out-of-wedlock children being born to low-income white people? It would seem that doesn't translate, because you don't believe that the problems of another person should be on your shoulders simply because they happen to share your skin color. And so it's a kind of unequal attribution. We look at black people and say, you fix your communities, but I'm an individual, I don't have to be concerned about, except for the general kind of civic, it's good to volunteer. I should be on the PTA kind of level of civic responsibility. But it's not a kind of idea that you are the travails of your fellow citizen are a reflection of your irresponsibility. We don't do that to white people. And so for me, for African Americans, I think it's just a matter of prudence and pragmatism that we have to try to organize and address issues that affect us mainly because historically that's been the means by which we've made progress. But I also reject the idea that somehow or another this was our responsibility to do that.
You're a historian. I'm by training a lawyer. I want to bring one piece in there that sort of comes together. I have had a great fascination with, even before going to law school, but pushed me to law school actually was a book called Simple Justice. And the whole concept in the history of Brown versus Board of Ed. And you mentioned it. You mentioned it in the Little Rock scenario. 1954, the Supreme Court basically says, because looking at these little children, that they need to go to school together, or it's unconstitutional for the state to basically format laws or practices that don't allow them to go together, that force them to go to separate schools. Well, here we are in 2018, and most of the public schools in America are segregated. What happened?
I think that so when I mentioned earlier that that Abraham Lincoln flirted with the idea of repatriating black people, well, not even repatriating, because that would have been sending people back to Africa, but basically deporting black people after the end of the Civil War. One of the problems, he wasn't the first person to think about that. That had been an idea that had bounced around even going back to the 18th century. And so one of the things that was a obstacle to achieving that was that there was a monetary incentive for importing black people to the United States. There is no monetary incentive for shouldering the cost to send us back. And so that's become the problem. There were incentives to create this racial hierarchy that we live in now, and there really aren't that many monetary incentives to undo it. And there's a lot of social cost. So there's kind of maybe conscience incentive that we know that the problems we have now were inherited, a product of the problems we had yesterday, that were created yesterday. But when we think about fiscally and economically, there's not a whole lot of motivation for that. And even moreover, if we were talking, I mean, when I talk with people about kind of dismantling the way that this operates, is that if I had a coupon in my pocket and I could use that coupon, not everyone had one, but I happen to have one, and I could use that coupon such that when I got a job, one, if I applied for a job, I'd be more likely to get an interview. If I got an interview, I'd be more likely to get the job, and if I would get the job, I'd be more likely to get a higher salary than someone who doesn't have this coupon. That if I move into a community where there are a bunch of people who have these coupons, even if we have the same income as the people who don't have the coupon, our homes will accrue value at a faster rate. And I can kind of whip out this coupon in moments of crisis, and it works on my behalf. Doesn't make everything perfect. We all have like the travails and difficulties of life, but this coupon works in some advantages. And then someone says, in the name of equality, we want you to give that coupon up. Like, hell no, I'm not giving that coupon up. Do you know what I've done with this coupon? It was like, equality is an ideal, that's fine. I mean, theoretically, I believe in that, but no, you're not taking my coupon. And so when we talk about, these issues around educational equality or kind of equalization of opportunity in American society, we're asking people to do that. And predictably, there are a lot of people who are not interested in doing that. I think that's why we wind up having the kind of intractable nature. But I don't think it's intractable, I shouldn't say intractable, but I think that's why we wind up having the difficult nature of addressing this problem.
Well, I think back to before I came to Vanderbilt, when I was working at Ohio State, and somehow at that point in time you were starting to, the concept of affirmative action in some of the universities, and a number of the Ivy Leagues that got together, and somehow, for some strange reason, we at Ohio State got an invitation to the meeting. I don't know if somebody didn't realize we weren't an Ivy League. And I got sent to it, and it was very interesting because we had to go around the country, and we had to basically have these forums. And they talked about affirmative action. They talked about equality. And it was very interesting as they put the people in groups, and they purposely separated them by gender, they separated them by race, they separated them by a lot of different things. It was very interesting. Everybody was for diversity until they had to pay into it. As long as it was your kid or your kid or your kid, that was fine. But then if it was my kid and I had gone through whatever we thought was the right thing to do, then I'm not for it. And doesn't that almost push back to that whole concept that if you go back to Brown, and you go back to this concept that there is something innately good, if you buy that, with us going to school together, then maybe the only way you can do it is by something like busing, by forcing it.
Well, see, here's the thing too about Brown, which is that I think that, and you don't know this, but the conversation around Brown has always been around like idealism, that we want children to go to school together because this will break down barriers and so on. But it was really much more cynical. Like, it wasn't idealistic at all. They struck upon the strategy of integration because, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was Thurgood Marshall's mentor, and they had kind of come up with the strategies, the legal strategies that culminated in Brown. They had spent a decade, really more, if you look at the NAACP's history, fighting what they call these equalization cases, right? Where they go into a school district, and they'd say, you spend $12 per child in your white school, you spend $1.75 per child in the black school. And they could prove this. Brown, Plessy versus Ferguson said you could have separate if it was equal. If you violated the equal part, then you could be forced to equalize. And they fought those cases again and again and again, and it was like the trial of Sisyphus, where you have to push the rock up the hill only to see it roll back. So you equalize for a year or two, and then you go right back to the status quo ante. And so it was at that point where they said, we've been fighting the equal part of the equation. We have to fight the separate part of the equation. The only way that they can not have a disparity between what they spend on the black kid and what they spend on the white kid is if you take the black kid and sit him or her next to the white kid in the same school, in the same classroom, in the same building. And so we're now going to get around the equal question by attacking the separate question, which is why when we look at that case, it's a weird case to fight segregation on. It's Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Topeka, Kansas is as Midwest as you get. The NAACP could have sued the school boards in Mississippi, could have sued the school boards in South Carolina. Actually, South Carolina was part of it, but Georgia, Alabama, the kind of Hall of Fame of racial segregation states. And just kind of a quick aside, I was I was in Boston recently, and I was talking with someone, and he was like shocked. The city of Boston has had like this kind of reckoning in the past year about its reputation for race and racism, and lots of white people didn't know this about Boston, which is interesting to me, but like very many black people know this. And I was talking with a white colleague who was expressing his shock that Boston has this reputation. And I was like, what? Boston is like the New York Yankees of racism, right? like you're not always the best, but you're always in contention to be the best. So they could have gone for one of those all-star states of segregation. They didn't. They went to sue a school district in the middle of the country whose version of segregation was really not as vehement as it was in lots of other places. And if you remember that case, it was because Linda Brown had to go out of her way to a different school. They weren't even claiming that there was a hierarchy in the values or the resources of those two schools. They were attacking the fact that she had to go to a separate school, period, because they were trying to get to the point of saying, we want to put black kids next to white kids in order to make it hard to give black kids the short shrift. And that was also why we saw immediately after that exodus of white children, especially in the South, into private schools. And I think those were the dynamics of it. So yeah, when we look at those kind of remedies like busing, it winds up kind of being like a game of whack-a-mole because we're moving the segregation around in some ways. And I don't think that there's no benefit to attempting to desegregate. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that we wind up with a lot more resistance and a lot more complication than people typically think when you're going into this. One of the other examples I'll give, just as one kind of quick thing to close out, is that in New York City in the 1950s, we don't even talk about the 60s or the 70s where things got really heated. In New York City in the 1950s, a Catholic school district, when the public schools were fighting over busing kids inside New York City, a Catholic school district said that they would accept black kids from low-income schools and give them quality education in keeping with their sense of mission as good Catholics. And they had a fire on their hands. All their good Catholic constituents revolted, even to the point where people boycotted and refused to give in the collection plates of their Catholic churches if it was going to support black kids coming to their schools. And so you have a choice of choosing between God and segregation, and you choose, I'm going to stick with segregation.
Well, of course, in America, God is white.
and American. Right?
And we'll close it on that, Dr. Cobb. Thank you very much.